If you have ever driven Interstate 10 through Arizona, somewhere between Tucson and Benson, you might have noticed something strange stretching along the tracks parallel to the highway. Something that goes on for 3 miles or more without any break. And what you are looking at is over 300 Union Pacific locomotives lined up end to end on a siding in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. Each one of those massive yellow machines worth somewhere between $1 and $3 million. And every single one of them is just sitting there waiting for a train to pull that may never actually come. Union Pacific is not the only railroad parking locomotives in the desert either, and this is not some temporary situation that just happened to coincide with your particular road trip through the Southwest. BNSF had 2,500 locomotives parked and out of service by the end of March 2020. And Union Pacific had somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 sidelined around that same time, according to multiple industry sources. And analysts who follow this business closely were estimating that between 20 and 30% of the entire Class 1 locomotive fleet in North America was sitting in storage somewhere, which works out to anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 individual units just collecting dust on sidings from Arizona to Montana. The railroads will tell you that the dry Arizona climate is perfect for storing locomotives because you do not have to worry about rust and rain and the other things that would deteriorate equipment sitting outside in wetter parts of the fit country. And they will say that these engines are checked and maintained on a regular schedule so that when demand returns, they can be pulled back into active service and ready to go within a reasonable time frame. And everything they tell you will be technically accurate, while completely missing the larger point of what is actually happening here. What is actually happening is that the American freight railroad industry has spent the last decade systematically cutting everything that costs money in pursuit of something called precision scheduled railroading. And while the locomotives sitting idle in the desert are perhaps the most visible symptom of this particular disease, they are far from the only consequence of this approach. Precision scheduled railroading was invented by a man named Hunter Harrison back in 1993 when he was running the Illinois Central. And the basic idea is that you run longer trains with fewer locomotives and fewer workers to achieve a lower operating ratio. And Wall Street absolutely loves this concept because a lower operating ratio means higher profits and higher stock prices, and that is all that really matters when you are managing a publicly traded company that needs to keep shareholders happy every single quarter without fail. Under PSR, the Class 1 railroads have cut their workforce by roughly 28% between 2011 and 2021, according to official government data, which works out to tens of thousands of jobs eliminated across the industry. And they have consolidated yards and reduced train starts and closed repair shops and done everything humanly possible to run the same amount of freight with fewer assets. The locomotives parked in the desert are the direct result of running longer trains, because when you combine what used to be 2 separate trains into one giant train that stretches 3 miles down the track, you only need 1 set of locomotives instead of 2, and that second set has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is usually a desert siding. The irony that should make you angry is that while thousands of locomotives are sitting unused in deserts and storage yards across this country, the shippers who depend on freight rail to move their products have been complaining bitterly for years about service that has gotten consistently worse. The Surface Transportation Board held emergency hearings in 2022 because the volume of complaints had reached a genuine crisis point, and what the shippers told them was that rates were going up and service was going down. And the railroads were not picking up cars in a timely manner, and scheduled switches were being skipped without explanation, and customer service departments had become essentially impossible to reach. One shipping industry executive stood up at those hearings and told the board that this was not a pandemic-related issue, but rather years of cuts that had systematically gutted the rail network. And he said that precision scheduled railroading was really just doing less with less. And he was absolutely right about that. The railroads had cut so deep in pursuit of operating ratios that when demand returned after the pandemic, they could not bring workers back fast enough, because the jobs had become so unattractive that people who had been furloughed were simply refusing to return to work that had become unbearable. A congressman named Peter DeFazio, who had been watching this unfold for years, put it about as bluntly as anyone in government could when he said that PSR in practice means the bottom line drives all the decisions, and that longer trains and unhappy shippers and a workforce pushed to do more with less is not a model anyone should chase after unless they work on Wall Street. And he said, "We cannot let hedge fund managers write the rules of American railroading." The locomotives sitting in the desert tell another story too, which is about the future of the locomotive manufacturing industry itself. A new Tier 4 locomotive that meets current emission standards costs well over $3 million, but rebuilding an older locomotive that is already sitting in storage costs about half that amount, and the regulations allow rebuilt locomotives to continue complying with their original emissions standards instead of current ones, which means the railroads have a massive financial incentive to keep rebuilding their existing fleet instead of ordering new. The numbers are staggering when you actually look at them closely. Over the past 10 years, only about 1,200 Tier 4 locomotives have been built for the entire North American market, which works out to an average of around 120 units per year, and that represents a dramatic collapse compared to the thousands of new locomotives that used to roll off assembly lines every year back when the industry was investing in growth instead of shrinking itself down to the bare minimum. General Electric eventually gave up and sold its entire transportation division to Westinghouse Air Brake, and EMD's parent company, Progress Rail, has struggled badly with reliability problems on its Tier 4 units, and the whole locomotive manufacturing sector has become a shadow of what it once was. The railroads would rather spend $1.5 million to rebuild a locomotive that has been sitting in storage for years than spend $3 million on a new one that they might not even need once the next economic downturn hits, and they have to park more power anyway. There are literally thousands of potential rebuild cores sitting on Class 1 rosters right now, and the industry consensus among analysts is that large orders for genuinely new power will likely be many years down the road if they ever come at all. And so the locomotives keep sitting in the Arizona desert, baking in the sun day after day, waiting for demand to meet supply, while the railroads keep cutting costs, and the shippers keep complaining, and the workers who remain keep running trains that are longer and longer, with crews that are smaller and smaller. A union official summed it up at those Surface Transportation Board hearings when he said that the railroads had run themselves so lean that they were only capable of handling the railroad of today, and they had lost all ability to handle economic shocks or unexpected changes in shipping patterns. And that is precisely what has happened time and again over the past several years. The locomotives are there waiting to be used. The track is there ready to carry freight. The customers have freight that needs to move. But the people who used to make the whole system actually work have been driven away by years of policies designed to maximize shareholder returns at the expense of everything else. And now, the industry is stuck with a fleet of extremely expensive machines that it cannot fully utilize because there is nobody left to run them. An engineer can look at those 3 miles of parked power in Arizona and understand perfectly well that somewhere in there is a locomotive that could pull his next train, but that knowledge does not help him one bit when there is nobody left to actually operate it, and the phone keeps ringing for another run while the power sits unused in the desert. That is where we are in the American freight rail industry in 2026, 3 miles of locomotives waiting in the desert sun for a call that may never come.